matching is hugely complicated because now I have to match, you know, perceptual, visual information with movement. So this is a fun chapter to get into. Anybody got any questions before we get started about anything, either content or assignment info?
Yeah, I had a question on the observation plan.
Okay.
I was just wondering, do we gotta fill up all 4 components or just 3?
I think I said, I can't remember off the top of my head, but I think I said a minimum of 3, didn't I? Or a maximum of...
Did I? Maximum of 5, minimum of 3. I just
Okay.
want to make sure though.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
And it depends on the skill that you pick, right? As to logically how many important components there are.
Okay. And so it could be anything, right? It could be anything like that we're familiar with?
Oh, I think so. Gosh, Zeke, you're asking me all kinds of things that involve my memory. Hang on.
You're good.
My memory's kind of fried. Let me have a look here and see what I said. Yes, pick a motor skill you're familiar with, but it can't be one of the fundamental motor skills that we covered in lab or that we've covered in the chapters.
Yeah, so like not like running or throwing or like...
Not fundamental running. So here's the thing, you could, right, we've only covered getting to competency in fundamental running. There are other versions of running, right, that come after fundamentals. So, you know, if you wanted to look at 100-meter sprinting, I mean, that doesn't look anything like stage 4 of fundamental running. Does that make sense?
Right.
Yeah.
Break down that rate.
Yeah, so you could take it into a sports skill, or, you know, you can take one of the fundamental skills and take them into the next level if you wanted to,
right.
or pick a completely
that
different.
makes it a lot easier.
Yeah, yeah. You know, so really the point is to try to show that you understand the concept of a component approach to assessment in relation to the total body approach to assessment that we did previously. So it's, you know, it's more about, can you show that you understand the idea of it, so that, you know, there's not a lot, you know, we talk a lot about we should be assessing a lot more than we do. But when we're talking about motor skills, one of the problems we have is that there aren't a lot of assessments out there for the vast range of motor skills that we have, right? And so if we're going to take on board the idea of assessing, then at some point you're going to have to start creating your own assessment tools, right? And then it depends what context you're in as to whether a total body like an MSU, TGMD type approach is appropriate or a component approach is more appropriate. So what I want to see is that you understand the component idea and that you can have a good shot at trying to create one. Does that help?
Yeah, that helped me a lot. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. Good, good. So, manipulative skills it is. Okay. Okay, so the first version of manipulation that we see in young children is what we technically call grasping, but like picking something up or holding something, okay? And when we're an adult, we often combine the reach and the grasp as one skill. But when we analyze it initially, what we see is that the reach and the grasp are two separate movements that gradually, with experience and practice, kind of merge together into the sort of action that we would see in an adult, right? So if I've poured myself a cup of tea, I don't have to reach for the cup and stop and touch the cup and then pick the cup up, right? I can reach and pick it up, and even I don't even have to be directly looking at it. I can be seeing it in my peripheral vision and mostly make a good reach and grasp, right? So as adults, we don't think of them as two separate skills, right? But we're going to look at them initially as separate, right? So we're going to look at grasping, picking up, holding, first of all. The fancy name is prehension, right? And Lois Halverson is a very famous researcher from a long time ago, from the early 1930s. She did heaps of research with infants, lots of filming, lots of analyzing, and she really laid the foundation for what we understand about grasping and reaching. And she has proposed 10, I don't know if they have the whole 10 here. No, they have the 4. 10 phases of development. And what we see when we watch what happens with prehension is that initially the infant is going to use what we call a power grip, right? So we are, as humans, we have this opposable thumb that gives us lots of variability with what we can do with our hands, right? It's one of the things, as well as the size of our brain, it's one of the things that puts us ahead of many other animals, right? Is this thumb that we have. But initially we don't use the thumb separately from the hand. So we go from what we call a power grip, where we use the whole hand, the palm, all the fingers on the toy or whatever it is, right? And we are working towards the developmental sequence that we see is working from this power to something that is a very fine motor skill and very precise, like a pinch grasp, right? So being able to do this pinch grasp that we can do is not, it is a developmental sequence. It takes time for the brain to get there. And if you think back to early in the semester when we were talking about our developmental laws of direction, remember that second law is from the midline out. And so it makes sense that as the nervous system and the muscular system, right, are developing, we get more and more control over our wrists and our fingers and our thumbs that we don't have initially, right? So it takes time for that law to kick in, and so we've got really fine control over what we can do with our fingers, right? Some people more than others. Like, I can't thread a needle to save my life. So my fine motor skills are very challenged. Okay? So one of what we now see as a constraint with Halverson's research is that she only used one task with her infants. So she had a 1-inch red little block, and that was what she would put in front of the infant, and then she would film what they did with it, and she would have the same child come back many, many times over the first year and a half or so, and watch what happened, right? So that's a big constraint when you think about the size of a baby's hand and the size of a little 1-inch block. So some of the behaviors that Halverson proposed, if we change the constraint, right? So if we change the piece of equipment, it's a task constraint, right? Then we see more advanced forms of grasping at an earlier age. So the sequence still holds true, but if I change the object, I get the more competent prehension earlier, right? Does that make sense? Right? And one of the other things we want to pay attention to is not just what happens with the hand when it's at the object, but what is happening with the hand during the reach, right? Because again, that changes over time, right? Let me see, do I have that diagram on here or do I? Yes, okay. So, here's my big power grasp, right? So the whole hand, and that happens around 8 weeks or so. Before 8 weeks, they really don't have enough control to be able to pick that up, okay? And then we see from the kind of whole hand, fingers and thumb, we start to see the thumb edge around the cube. So we're still using the palm and the fingers, but the thumb starts to become more opposable, right? So that takes about 3 or 4 weeks of practice for that to happen. And then by about 5 months, they're able to pick the block up without using their palm, just using their fingers and thumb. Okay? So, by about 9 months, we start to see that the hand is shaping itself during the reach so that it's the correct shape to pick up the object. So that takes quite a long time, right? Before that, what happens is they reach, they touch, right? They have to kind of feel it and then they pick it up. So by about 9 months, which is, they sit up independently about 8 months. So sitting up independently and being able to reach in 8 months. Am I a bit late on that? 7 months? Reach and grasp. So once they can sit, then their hands are free and we start to see advances in this grasping situation. I forgot my notes today, so you'll have to excuse me. I went to the office to pick them up and everything, but somehow or other I managed to leave them behind. So think about what you do, right? What shape does your hand make if you're going to pick up a pencil, for example, right? So you've already started probably closing your fingers and getting ready for the pencil during the reach, right? What do you do if you want to pick up a heavy book? Like if it's a really heavy book, do you even reach with one hand? At what point does your brain say, that looks like it's going to need two hands, right? And honestly, do we do that consciously, right? Most of the time, no, right? I don't look at something that's big and go, oh, I probably need to use two hands to pick that up. It's like my brain gets the picture of the object, it makes a decision about the properties of that object, and we automatically reach with two hands. Now that can catch us out sometimes, right? Because, for example, if there's a big cardboard box, then you might assume that big cardboard box is heavy and reach with two hands, pick it up, and it actually has nothing in it, and that throws you off your balance a little bit, right? Because you've applied all this force that you didn't need to apply because your brain made an assumption about the properties of the box, right? So we can start to think about my perception of the object influences the reach, right? The hand position and the planned force production. Okay? So it's manipulative skills are just fascinating, I think. And then what about if it's a crystal vase that your grandmother had from her mother, right? How are you going to reach and grasp for that? What changes when we change the constraint, right? So you can see here some pictures that show how our hand position changes in preparation for the picking up of the object. So quite a long time later, after Halverson, and Newell is one of the researchers that really started the constraints. Remember, it's Newell's constraints theory. So he was really starting to use that triangle idea to drive how he set up his research. And what he found was that we actually have an element of body scaling with regards to how we shape our hands, right? And what he discovered was that it's the ratio of the hand size to the object size. So your brain does this kind of calculation on that ratio, and it's very consistent. Doesn't matter what age group we look at, the ratio is consistent between older infants through to adults, right? So the point at which my brain transitions from a one-handed reach to a two-handed reach is based on the ratio of my hand size to the size of the object. So that's the key, is this relationship between how big my hand is and how big the object is, right? So it's really interesting that what he found was that this ratio stays consistent across time. hold on 1 minute, I'm just going to flick through a bit here. So I'm trying to decide. I want it in there. Okay, so. All right, so then if we look at the reaching phase, remember that as infants, these two things are separate and then they gradually merge together into one movement as we get older. So one of the things that they find interesting is at what point does our initial stereotypies that we watched on the film, right, at what point do these stereotypies change to I'm deliberately reaching for a mobile above my cot, for example, right? And do the mechanisms involved in what the brain is going through involve matching my hand to the object or learning to control the arm? And so what the research with the infants indicates is that it's probably more about controlling this heavy arm initially than it is about matching the hand and the object. So we don't see the changes in the hand shape until later on. But the first thing the brain has to learn to do is control the weight of this arm, or both arms. Okay. So this is an interesting experiment that they do with older teenagers, adults, people your age, older adults, which just shows how what you can see, like the visual perception of the object, really dictates what happens with the arm and the hand. Okay? So in this experiment, they had a prism that someone was looking through that changed the position of the object. Right? So you can see here that the target button they were reaching for. So this is a lab experiment. This would be probably a button or a ball that they had to hit or something like that. So with the prism alters where the button ball appears to be. And so when they start to reach, right, that reach is heading towards the wrong place. But once they get a bigger field of vision, they can change the reach pattern to go to the correct place. Right? But that's interesting because it shows how strongly that visual stimulus is linked to the action that we perform. Does that make sense? Right? So the vision really drives the action. And if you look, this diagram is on page 132. Right? And it's just a fascinating piece of research when you think about like catching a ball. So for Ryan as a baseball player, right? What's involved in catching a ball that's flying through the air on a baseball field? Right? Because when you're really good at catching and it's automatic, right, you don't really comprehend all the steps that are involved there, right? Does that, you keep trying to put the information into a real world scenario for yourselves, right? Because the lab experiment doesn't mean anything, right? But can I put that information into a real world situation where I have to reach and be in the right place at the right time? So initially, when the infant is young, remember our brain is working as one piece initially. So my right side of my brain controls my left arm, my left side of my brain controls my right arm, and when we're very young, those two hemispheres can't uncouple initially, so we see both arms going at the same time, even for a small object. Right? So takes 2 to 3 months of practice for the brain to start uncoupling, so it'll reach with both hands, but it will push one hand forward more than the other. Now, this is not a sign of dominance, right, left or right-handedness, because that doesn't really develop until almost about 4 years old, right? So if you watch young infants reaching and picking things up, it's variable which hand they use, okay? And so for the first year or so, the child will sometimes use 2 hands, sometimes use 1 hand, then it might go back for a month or so using 2 hands, because the brain is learning all this information, right? How do I control these arms? Remember, there's a huge growth spurt going on, so the arm, the length of the arm, the weight of the arm, how strong the muscles are is changing rapidly over those first 12 months. And so, you know, at times it might be easier to go with 2 hands, and then after a growth spurt go with 1 hand again. So it's very variable for the first period of time. Now what's interesting, if you think about the toys we tend to buy for a child for their first birthday, right? By about 12 months, the brain is able to uncouple and do mirrored type actions with the hands. So you think about the sorts of toys that we buy them for their first birthday. We buy those stickle bricks, you know, that they can pull apart, or felt and Velcro type toys that they can pull apart, right? So what's happening there, although both hands are going out, right? One hand is going in one direction and the other hand is going in the other direction. So that's a big step for the brain to pull apart a toy, right? By about 1.5 years, we start to see some cooperation between manipulations. So another really great toy for them at this age are those boxes that have shapes cut out, and then they've got blocks, and they have to match the shape of the block to the shape of the hole in the box, right? So that takes fine motor control and manipulation, and also understanding over time of the shape, right? If you watch a child when they first get that toy and they're very young, they'll be picking up the roll, the circle toy, and trying to get it into the square or the hexagonal hole, right? Because they're not comprehending the boundary, the edges of the shape, well enough to match the shape to the hole yet. Right? So again, that perception of the environment, of the object, plays a big role in the outcome of the movement pattern. Right? By about going into their second year, so after their first birthday, they also like to start using objects as tools. So this is a good time to give them a wooden spoon and an old saucepan, and they'll start to be banging the spoon on the saucepan, right? And then they'll transition to, there might be a little hammer with their box and their shapes, right? And they'll start to transition to banging the shape in with a hammer, for example, right? So all these actions that we are familiar with, if we've had any kids in the family, you know, then they all have a purpose. They're all on this developmental sequence of manipulative skills and the brain learning how to uncouple and do different things with both hands. Right? By the end of year 2, so coming for around their second birthday, we can see what they call complementary activities. So that is something like unscrewing a jam jar, right? So I'm going to hold the jar with one hand, and I'm going to turn the lid with the other hand. So that takes almost 24 months for the brain to be able to do 2 such different things, right? Undoing your tube of toothpaste is a complementary activity if we give it an adult context, right? So undoing the tube, holding the toothbrush, putting the toothpaste on, okay? Those are complementary. Doing up your shoelaces is a complementary activity. Okay. So imagine, some of you have probably had an injury where you've had your hand and your wrist in a plaster cast, right? Think about what that's, so now how do I undo the tube of toothpaste, right? What does that structural constraint add to the interaction to change the emerging motor pattern, right? If I've got a hand in a cast, then what do I do? Put the tube of toothpaste under my arm and undo the tube of toothpaste maybe, right? And then I'm going to have to put the toothbrush under my arm and squeeze the toothpaste onto the toothbrush. Completely different movement pattern than if I've got both hands available. Does that make sense? Right? And as I mentioned earlier, posture, right, being able to sit or stand and free up my hands makes a huge difference in the development of these manipulative skills. So if we go all the way back to our early first self-locomotion, the children who butt slide rather than creep on their hands and knees tend to have slightly advanced manipulation skills because they butt slide and their hands are already free. Whereas the children who are creeping on hands and knees have to stop, shift their weight, get their balance, pick their hands up, right? It's a very, very different procedure to manipulate from creeping than it is to manipulate from bum scooting. Right? So the more postural control we have, the the more opportunity we have to practice reaching. And I think, hold on, because I want to just have a look at how many. That's 11, that leaves me 15. No, let's do 1. Okay. So, reaching, grasping is pretty stable across adulthood. We sometimes see some decline after the age of 50, which means I'm way down there, right? The movements slow down, the coordination isn't quite as good. In my opinion, there's a lot that plays into that, right? If that adult is low active, then they could be losing some strength in their shoulders, their traps, their lats, that would slow down that reaching action, right? They may have some arthritis in their hands or their elbow that slows it down or changes their ability for coordination. It could be a visual issue, right? By about 45, you will find that however hard you try, your vision starts changing. And so that impacts reaching and grasping, right? There's a little bit, some studies have shown that there's a little bit of change in handwriting. Again, I think it's going to depend. Like I remember watching my nan's handwriting change. Like she would write birthday cards and Christmas cards and things every year, and you could see that change. She lived to 92, so you could see some distinct changes. Like the shape of the handwriting was the same, but the strength of the handwriting seemed to change, right? So she couldn't press as hard on the paper, and there would be some wobble in the lines, right? But at 92, what do you expect? You don't see that, in my opinion. You don't see that at 50, right? So when they're talking about adulthood, some of this information means elderly, right? Accuracy is maintained, especially in what they call well-practiced tasks. So we'll talk about driving, for example. Driving is a manipulative skill, especially in areas of the country where you use manual, like I drive a manual stick. In the UK, there are a lot more manual sticks than there are over here. You know, more people drive an automatic car in the States because you've got such vast distances to cover, you know. An automatic is easier, you don't, right? But what they find is that with driving, that older adults actually maintain their accuracy pretty well. From a manipulative point of view, the bigger problems with driving are hearing and vision. Where are we going? Okay, no, let's go, oops. So, rapid aiming movements. This could be, for example, a very clear example of a rapid aiming movement is the sort of action that has to occur in a military cockpit, right? In a helicopter or in a plane, right? I have to be able to reach and press a button very quickly, right? In everyday life, it could just be reaching for a cup of coffee, right? So that's quite an interesting mechanical picture to look at because we see a change in the pattern of acceleration, deceleration. So if you think about what happens, if my hand is stationary, so this is going back to chapter 3, right? If my hand is stationary and I move my hand and pick up a cup of coffee, then I've had to apply force to move that object, my arm, from stationary to moving, right? So law number 1. And then I have to apply a force to go from moving to stationary, right? So we have 2 phases of force production, force application in reaching, right? So they split that as acceleration and deceleration, right? You can't accelerate all the way into the cup of coffee. You'd knock it over and it would go everywhere, right? So I have to accelerate, I have to go from 0 to moving, and then from moving back to around 0 as I pick the cup up, right? So let me draw you this because it's going to be easier to visualize if I draw it for you. So a younger adult, you guys, okay, this is going to be a very bad picture of a hand. And here's a cup of coffee. Oops. Right? So, let's see if I can get this. For you, for younger adults, what we have is a relatively smooth, and it's going to be very difficult for me to draw, but a relatively smooth phase, right? This is acceleration here, and this is deceleration here, okay? What we see with older adults, let's change the color, is a different picture. So can an older adult reach out their hand and pick up a cup of coffee? Yes, of course they can, right? Unless they've got some kind of structural constraint. But when we look at it mechanically and we look at force production, what we see with an older adult is that they, oops, let's go back to my pencil, is that they accelerate for a much shorter period of time and then they decelerate for a much longer period of time. Right? So having got the arm moving, it takes longer to slow it down. And that's partly due to the change in strength. Right? So from a mechanical point of view, it's quite an interesting development that we see, this change. Right? I have to decelerate for much longer as I get older. going to stop there because without my notes, I want to talk to you about haptic perception. Maybe I can talk to you about that. Let's have a quick chat about haptic perception, and then I will do some more information on haptic perception. So haptic perception is information we can learn without looking at an object. So what can I learn about something without seeing it? Okay? By touching it, what can I find out? So haptic perception is very interesting because it explains a lot of the manipulative behavior we see in infants. Okay? So, it's called haptic perception. Oops, probably need an R in there. So, give me an idea, right? I think there are 6 off the top of my head. So, what's something you can learn about an object without looking at it? Isabel. What can I learn about an object without looking at it? Glory, help me out here. What can I look at? What can I tell about an object without looking at it if I'm just touching it?
You can know from the shape of it.
Right, good. Shape.
How it's positioned.
Sorry, say that again.
You can learn how it's positioned.
Yes. Let me sit on that one for a little while. So we've got shape. What else can I tell? Zarian.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so if your eyes are closed, if I have you blindfolded, and I give you an ice cube, how do you know it's an ice cube?
It'd be cold and probably start to melt in my hand.
Okay, right? So we can tell temperature, right? So we can do shape, we can do temperature. What about if I gave you a piece of velvet and I gave you a piece of potato sacking?
Weight.
Oh, that wasn't the one I was thinking of, but yes, you can do weight. Good. How do I distinguish the velvet from the sacking material?
The texture.
Yes, very good. Well done. What about if I give you a marshmallow and I give you a hard candy? What's different between the marshmallow and the
I don't
candy?
know how to put it, not consistency, but, or like.
Okay, like hardness.
Like one soft, squishy, the hard candy's gonna be more solid and most likely heavier.
Perfect. Okay, hardness. All right, we've got one more. Ha-ha. And now I've got to really dig into my brain to think about what the last one is so I can give you a good example. Shape, texture, hardness. Come on, Sarah. Texture, hardness. Uh-oh, I'm having old lady brain fart. I can't think of what the sixth one is. So maybe what we'll do is stop there and we'll pick up with number 6 on, oh gosh, after spring break, I guess. Okay. All right. So, let me ask you this. Is number 6 color?
I was thinking it was size, because if you're not, I mean.
Size? I think you're right. I think it's size.
I was thinking, yeah, because there's size of like sound, if you shake it, you can kind of see what it sounds like, but.
I think you're right. I think it could be size. Well done. So, is color a characteristic of an object I can find out by touching the object without seeing it?
I guess technically, if you touch it, you know what it is. Like if you touch a banana, you know it's a banana. You can say.
Oh, okay, but you're making.
Well, I technically, but I don't think so. I mean,
No, absolutely, because by touching it and identifying it as a banana and therefore it's yellow, you couldn't tell it was yellow unless you knew it was a banana. Does that make sense? So what if you've never seen a banana in your life and someone gives you a banana, would you know what color it was?
Of course not.
No, right. There you go, right? So color isn't something we can tell using haptic perception, right? Color is a different type of characteristic of an object. Okay? All right, well done. Okay, so today's Thursday. Tomorrow we won't have lab. I want you to work on your playground analysis. All right? I will be in the Collaborate classroom in case you have questions that you'd like some help with, okay? But we don't have a formal lab session tomorrow. I'll just be there if you need me. All right? And on that note, have a lovely spring break. All right? Please stay safe. I know New Mexico is doing quite well. The data that came out from the governor's office yesterday was excellent for a lot of the state. But please don't think that that means it's safe to have big parties that are indoors without masks on, because it isn't, okay? So use some sense, stay safe, okay? And make sure that everybody comes back healthy on the 22nd of March. All right? Bye.
Yep. We have a good spring break also.
Thank you.